The rain poured like a curtain from heaven, drowning the small streets of Detroit's East Side. Grace Carter clutched her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she hurried across the cracked sidewalk, holding her son Elijah close. The boy's small arms wrapped around her neck, his face buried against her wet shoulder. They had just left the diner where Grace worked a double shift, and her shoes squeaked with every step through the flooded street. "Mom, I'm cold," Elijah whispered. "I know, baby. We'll be home soon," she said softly, forcing a smile through chattering teeth. Home was barely more than a rented room in an old building with a leaking roof, but to Grace, it was the only safe place left after losing her husband in a factory accident last year. Since then, life had become a battle between bills and faith. As she reached the corner, she saw something unusual, a frail elderly woman standing alone under a flickering streetlight, clutching a handbag and a soaked coat. The old woman's gray hair clung to her face, and her eyes darted around in confusion. Grace hesitated. Detroit wasn't a city where you stopped for strangers at night, but something in the woman's trembling hands broke her heart. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Grace called out. The old woman turned slowly. I can't find my son's house," she said, her voice quivering. "My phone died. I think I'm lost." Grace glanced down at Elijah, whose eyes reflected both fear and curiosity. She knew what it was like to be lost, with no one to turn to, nowhere to go. For a moment, the sound of thunder filled the silence between them. Grace took a deep breath. "Come with us," she said finally. "It's not much, but at least you'll be dry." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that for me?" Grace smiled softly. "Someone once helped me when I had nothing. I'm just passing it on." They walked together through the storm, three souls bound by chance. By the time they reached Grace's small apartment, everyone was shivering. She gave Elijah her coat and handed the old woman a towel, then poured the last of their instant soup into 3 chipped bowls. Elijah looked up. "Mom, what's her name?" The woman smiled faintly. "Eleanor. Eleanor Blake." Grace froze for a second. That name sounded familiar, but before she could ask, lightning flashed outside and the power went out, leaving only the sound of rain and 3 quiet hearts beating in the dark. The room was dim, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning outside. Grace lit a small candle and set it on the worn table, its flickering glow dancing across the cracked walls. The power outage was nothing new, just another reminder of how fragile life had become. Eleanor sat wrapped in a blanket, her hands trembling as she held the warm bowl of soup. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "You didn't have to take me in. Most people wouldn't." Grace smiled tiredly. "I know what it's like to be out there with nowhere to go. You remind me of my mom." Eleanor looked up, her gray eyes glistening. "Is she still with you?" Grace hesitated, her smile fading. "She passed away a few years ago. Cancer." A quiet sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. "I'm sorry. Losing someone you love, it leaves a hole that never quite closes." Grace nodded slowly. "Yeah, but Elijah keeps me strong." The boy, now asleep on the couch, clutched his small stuffed bear like a shield against the storm. Grace brushed a strand of wet hair from her forehead. She looked back at Eleanor, who seemed to be staring at the child with an expression she couldn't quite read, a mix of sorrow and recognition. "You said your name was Eleanor Blake?" Grace asked, curiosity tugging at her. "I used to clean offices downtown for a company called Blake Industries. Any chance you're related?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. She hesitated before answering. "My late husband founded that company," she said softly, "but I haven't been there in years. My son took over after his father passed." Grace blinked, stunned. "Wait, you mean Daniel Blake? The billionaire?" Eleanor nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "Yes, Daniel's my son. I was on my way to visit him. We had an argument months ago, and I thought maybe I could make peace. But I got lost after the taxi driver dropped me at the wrong street." Grace's heart pounded. She had spent years cleaning floors at Blake Industries, often watching expensive cars pull in and out, wondering what kind of lives the people inside lived. And now one of them was sitting in her kitchen, sipping soup from a chipped bowl. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "I wasn't always proud of how I raised him," she murmured. "Money can blind a person, Grace. It can make them forget what truly matters." Grace wanted to ask more, but exhaustion settled over her. The storm outside softened into a steady drizzle, and the rhythmic tapping on the window lulled her toward sleep. As she drifted off, Eleanor whispered almost to herself, "Sometimes God takes us to the darkest places, just to remind us who the light really is." Neither of them noticed the black SUV slowly turning the corner, its headlights slicing through the fog, stopping for a brief moment in front of Grace's building before quietly driving away into the night. The morning light crept timidly through the thin curtains, turning the gray of night into pale gold. Grace stirred from the couch, her back aching from the hard cushions. For a brief, precious moment, she forgot the storm, the bills, and the uncertainty. The smell of something warm filled the air. Coffee. Eleanor was in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured steaming water over a chipped mug. "Good morning, dear," she said with a gentle smile. "I found the coffee in your cupboard. I hope you don't mind." Grace rubbed her eyes. "Mind? You're a miracle worker. I didn't even know I had any left." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Sometimes blessings hide in small places." Elijah woke next, hair messy, eyes half open. "Grandma?" he mumbled. Eleanor laughed softly, stroking his hair. "Not quite, sweetheart, but close enough." Grace watched the two of them and felt something stir deep inside. A strange, comforting familiarity. It had been a long time since anyone filled her kitchen with warmth like that. For a moment, it felt like family. But the peace was short-lived. A deep rumble outside made the window panes tremble. Elijah ran to peek through the curtain. "Mom, there's a big car outside!" Grace frowned and joined him. Parked in front of the building was a sleek black SUV, its windows tinted, engine idling. The kind of car she'd only seen in magazines or outside corporate towers. Her stomach tightened. "Probably someone lost," she murmured, but her voice betrayed the unease crawling up her spine. Moments later, a firm knock echoed through the apartment. Grace exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who looked just as puzzled. She walked to the door cautiously, heart pounding. When she opened it, a tall man in a dark suit stood there, his shoes polished, raincoat still damp. His gaze shifted from Grace to the older woman behind her, and his expression faltered. "Mrs. Blake?" he said, his voice low but urgent. "We've been searching for you all night." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Oh dear! Daniel sent you!" "Yes, ma'am," the man replied, stepping closer. "Your son's been frantic. He called the police, hospitals. He thought something terrible happened." Grace's mouth went dry. She turned to Eleanor, who looked shaken but relieved. "I didn't mean to cause a fuss," the old woman murmured, clutching her bag. "I just wanted to make things right with him." The man looked at Grace with a polite nod. "You must be the one who helped her." Grace shrugged awkwardly. Anyone would have done the same. He smiled faintly. Not everyone would have opened their home to a stranger during a storm. Eleanor reached out, her frail hand covering Grace's. "You're not just anyone, dear. You're the kind of soul the world still needs." The man handed Grace a card embossed with gold letters. Blake Estates. "Mr. Blake would like to thank you personally. Could you come with us?" Grace froze. Her shift at the diner started in an hour. She couldn't afford to miss it. But when she looked at Eleanor's kind face and then at her curious son, something inside whispered, maybe this is one of those moments when saying yes changes everything. She took a deep breath, gripping Elijah's hand. "All right," she said softly. "We'll come." As they stepped outside, the SUV door opened, revealing leather seats and a scent of luxury Grace had never known.
Elijah's eyes sparkled in wonder. And as the car pulled away from the cracked sidewalk, Grace couldn't help but feel it. The quiet certainty that this drive was leading her to a destiny she never saw coming. The SUV glided through Detroit's wealthy suburbs, where every lawn looked freshly cut and every house glimmered with glass and marble. Grace held Elijah's hand tightly, her pulse racing as she stared out the window. The city she knew so well, cracked sidewalks, neon diners, the hum of exhaustion, had vanished behind them. Here, everything felt too quiet, too perfect. Eleanor sat beside her, silent but calm, gazing out the window as though she were returning to a world she'd once ruled. When the car finally turned onto a long private driveway lined with sycamore trees, Grace's breath caught in her throat. At the end stood a mansion, not a house, a monument, with tall white pillars and glimmering windows that seemed to watch them approach. The driver parked near the front steps and hurried to open Eleanor's door. "Mrs. Blake, Mr. Daniel is inside waiting," he said respectfully. Grace helped the old woman out, but her hands were trembling. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked softly. Eleanor nodded. "Sometimes the hardest doors to knock on are the ones we once closed ourselves." Elijah tugged at Grace's jacket. "Mom,
This place looks like a castle," she smiled nervously. "Yeah, baby, a castle for people who live a very different kind of life." Inside, the air smelled of roses and polished wood. Chandeliers glowed like captured stars. Grace felt painfully out of place. Her thrift store shoes left faint wet marks on the marble floor. She whispered to Elijah, "Don't touch anything." A man's voice echoed down the grand staircase. "Mother!" Daniel Blake descended with long, confident strides, handsome in a tailored suit, the kind of man who commanded every room without trying. But when he saw his mother, his composure broke. He rushed to her side, eyes wet. "We searched everywhere. You could have been hurt." Eleanor smiled weakly. "I'm fine, Danny. I just took a wrong turn." He sighed, shaking his head. "A wrong turn that nearly gave me a heart attack." Then his gaze shifted to Grace and Elijah. His expression softened, but his tone carried the weight of curiosity. "And you are?" Grace straightened, nervous. "Grace Carter, sir. This is my son Elijah. We found your mother lost last night and offered her shelter." Daniel looked at his mother with disbelief. "You stayed in her apartment?" Eleanor lifted her chin proudly. "Yes, and she treated me with more kindness than most people in this house ever have." Daniel looked embarrassed. He stepped toward Grace and extended his hand. "Thank you, truly. I owe you more than words can say." Grace hesitated before shaking it. "No debt, Mr. Blake. Just glad she's safe." A butler appeared. "Sir, breakfast is ready." Daniel gestured toward the dining room. "Please, join us. It's the least I can offer." Grace wanted to refuse, but Elijah's eyes lit up at the smell of pancakes and bacon. So she nodded. As they sat at the long, gleaming table, Elijah swung his legs under the chair, trying to act polite. Eleanor smiled, clearly enjoying the sight. Daniel leaned back, studying Grace. "Where do you work, Miss Carter?" "I'm a waitress at Benny's Diner. Double shifts most days." He frowned. "That's a rough neighborhood." Grace shrugged. "Rougher than this one, yeah, but honest work doesn't scare me." There was something in her tone, strength wrapped in humility, that caught Daniel off guard. He smiled faintly. "I can see that." Just as breakfast was ending, a maid rushed into the room and whispered something to Daniel. His smile faded. He turned sharply toward his mother. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Eleanor blinked. "Tell you what, dear?" "About the will. About what Father left behind for you." Grace froze, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down her cup. "Because it wasn't for me," she said softly. "It was for someone else." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean you don't know who it's for?" Eleanor looked at Grace, her eyes heavy with a truth she had carried for years. "It's time you both knew," she said, voice breaking. "Grace, you're not here by accident." The room fell silent. Even the ticking of the antique clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. Daniel's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup as he turned sharply toward his mother. "What do you mean she's not here by accident?" Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Mrs. Blake, what are you talking about?" Eleanor's frail fingers trembled as she clasped them together. "I've lived with a burden for many years, a choice I made that still haunts me." Her voice wavered like the flame of a dying candle. "Grace, years ago, long before Daniel was born, I had a sister. She was much younger than me. Her name was Ruth Carter." Grace blinked, confused. "Carter? That's my last name." Eleanor nodded slowly, tears welling up. "I know, because Ruth was your grandmother." Grace's mind reeled. "That's impossible." "I wish it were," Eleanor said, her gaze drifting to the window as rain began to fall again. "Ruth fell in love with a man my parents disapproved of, a factory worker. They cast her out, and I was too afraid to defend her. She left with nothing but a suitcase and her faith. We never saw her again. Years later, I tried to find her, but the trail was cold. Until last night." Grace covered her mouth, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo. "You're saying we're family?" Eleanor reached out, her wrinkled hand covering Grace's trembling one. "You're my niece, dear. And that beautiful boy of yours," she smiled faintly at Elijah, who sat wide-eyed, "is my great-grandnephew." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "This is insane. How could you not tell me we had family living like this?" Eleanor looked up at him, pain etched in her expression. "Because I didn't know, Daniel. I didn't know until I saw her eyes last night. Your father always said I have the same look when I was her age, the same quiet strength." Grace's mind was spinning. Her whole life she'd felt invisible, cleaning offices, counting pennies, praying for small mercies. Now,
the elegant woman was telling her she was family to one of the wealthiest names in Detroit. "I don't understand," Grace whispered. "Why me? Why now?" Eleanor took a deep, trembling breath. "Because your grandmother's share of the family estate was never claimed. When she was disowned, my father left her portion in a trust in case she ever returned. It's been untouched for decades." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You mean she's entitled to—" Eleanor nodded. "Half of what your father built. Legally, it belongs to her bloodline, to Grace." The words hung heavy in the air. Grace shook her head in disbelief. "No, I don't want anyone's money. I just wanted to help." Eleanor's eyes softened. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Daniel turned away, pacing near the window. His world, built on privilege and control, was crumbling. "So what happens now?" he muttered. Eleanor stood slowly, leaning on her cane. "What happens now," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "is redemption. For me, for this family." Then she turned to Grace and smiled with quiet conviction. "You opened your door to a stranger. Now heaven is opening one for you." At that moment, the same black SUV that had brought them there rolled up again in front of the mansion. The driver knocked gently on the window, signaling Daniel. "Sir," he said, "there's someone outside asking for Miss Grace Carter." Grace frowned. "For me?" The driver nodded. "He said his name is Benjamin Hayes. He claims he works for the estate office." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "The estate office? That can't be right. Why would they come here?" Eleanor's smile deepened, a knowing light in her eyes. "Because, Daniel, fate doesn't wait for permission." Grace's heart pounded as the doors to her past and future stood open before her. She took Elijah's hand and whispered, "Maybe this storm wasn't meant to drown us after all." The front doors opened with a gust of cold air as the man stepped inside. Tall, impeccably dressed, holding a black leather briefcase. His presence carried quiet authority. "Good morning," he said with a polite nod. "I'm Benjamin Hayes, attorney for the late Mr. William Blake's estate. I was told Ms. Grace Carter is here." Grace rose slowly, her palms sweating. "That's me, though I'm not sure why you'd be looking for me." Benjamin opened the briefcase, carefully pulling out a thick folder sealed with an embossed family crest. "We've been searching for a Ruth Carter descendant for years. The Blake Family Trust contained a clause specifying that if any living relative of Ruth Carter were found, her rightful share of the estate would transfer immediately." Daniel stiffened. That clause was ancient, irrelevant. Benjamin adjusted his glasses calmly. "Irrelevant or not, it's still legally binding, Mr. Blake. The funds and properties tied to Ruth Carter's name were never redistributed. Ms. Grace Carter's identification and bloodline confirmation make her the rightful heir." Grace's mouth dried. "Wait, bloodline confirmation?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes soft but resolute. "Last night, while you were sleeping, I called the family physician. He took a DNA swab before dawn. I had to know the truth." She smiled faintly. "You are, without question, my sister's granddaughter." Daniel's chair screeched against the marble floor as he stood, anger flickering beneath his calm tone. "You can't just walk in here and hand half of our company to a waitress from the East Side." Grace flinched. "I don't want your company. I don't want your money. I just—" Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady but stern. "Daniel Blake, enough." The flail woman's tone carried the weight of command, the same tone that once ran the Blake empire alongside her husband. "This young woman gave me shelter when you didn't even answer my calls. Her compassion restored my faith in humanity. She deserves respect, not suspicion." Benjamin cleared his throat. "If I may continue, the documents transfer not just assets, but decision rights. Ms. Carter has the option to claim her inheritance or sign it over. Either way, she must visit the estate office today to confirm." Grace looked between them, the attorney's calm, Eleanor's pride, Daniel's fury. Her heart raced. "I don't know anything about money or companies. I just wanted to help someone lost in the rain." Eleanor reached for her hand. "And that's why you're the one worthy of what was lost. Grace, this isn't about wealth. It's about restoring a family that was broken by pride." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're letting emotion rewrite history." "No," Eleanor whispered, her eyes glistening. "I'm letting love correct it." The tension hung heavy. Elijah tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, are we rich now?" he asked innocently. The question broke the silence, drawing a small laugh from Benjamin and even a reluctant smirk from Daniel. Grace knelt to meet her son's gaze. "No, baby, we're just blessed. There's a difference." Benjamin handed her a pen.
"All you need is your signature, Miss Carter." Grace hesitated, her fingers hovering over the paper. Signing it would change everything. Her life, Elijah's future, and the Blake's legacy. But deep inside, something stronger than fear whispered that maybe God had brought her into this storm to heal more than one broken soul. As the pen touched the paper, Daniel turned away, fists clenched. "This isn't over," he muttered. Eleanor watched him go, sadness clouding her face. "He'll understand one day," she said softly, "when he learns that Grace isn't just a name, it's a gift." Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but echoing, like a promise that the storm hadn't finished revealing what it came to wash clean. Daniel stormed out of the dining room, his polished shoes echoing down the marble hallway. He could feel anger burning through his veins, not just at the situation, but at himself. How could this stranger walk into his life overnight and take half of everything he had built? How could his mother, the woman he loved most, side with her? Grace watched him disappear, her chest heavy with unease. Maybe I should just leave. I never wanted to cause trouble. Eleanor shook her head firmly. Grace, listen to me. The trouble was already here. You just revealed it. Before Grace could answer, Benjamin's phone buzzed. He frowned. Excuse me. I need to take this. He stepped aside, murmuring into the receiver while flipping through papers. Meanwhile, Elijah tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, is he mad at us? Grace knelt, brushing a curl from her forehead. Maybe a little, sweetheart. But sometimes people get angry when they don't understand what's really happening. From the far end of the hallway, Daniel's voice broke through, tense and sharp. I don't care what it takes, Richard. Find a loophole. I want that transfer reversed before the day's over. Eleanor sighed. He's so much like his father. Strong, brilliant, and blinded by pride. Grace bit her lip. Maybe he just needs time. Maybe, Eleanor murmured, though her tone said she wasn't sure. Moments later, Benjamin returned, his face pale. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice. It's about Mr. Daniel Blake's records. Daniel re-entered just then, scowling. What records? Benjamin hesitated. Financial, personal. Mr. Blake, your father's trust included an emergency clause. In the event of major family conflict, the executor was authorized to review all current Blake accounts for compliance. Daniel frowned. Meaning? He exhaled slowly. Meaning your recent charitable foundation transactions are being audited, and one of them links directly to Benny's Diner. Grace blinked. Benny's Diner? That's where I work. Eleanor's gaze snapped to her son. Daniel, what did you do? Daniel's jaw tightened. It was nothing. I made a few donations under the company's name, trying to clean up the area, support small businesses. Except one of those donations was traced to an account that matches Grace Carter's employee payroll. It seems you've been unknowingly paying for her salary for almost 6 months. The room still. Grace stared at him in disbelief. You're saying you've been paying me? Daniel's face flushed. Not directly. I didn't even know your name until last night. My company partners with small local projects. Benny's Diner was one of them. I wanted to fund meals for single mothers during the winter. He hesitated. I guess I never expected to meet one of them. Eleanor's lips trembled with emotion. Don't you see, Daniel? You were helping her long before you knew who she was. This isn't about money or power. It's about grace, in every sense of the word. Daniel's anger began to soften. He looked at Grace, and for the first time saw her not as a threat, but as a reflection of kindness, strength, and humility he'd long forgotten. I thought I was the one saving people. Turns out maybe God was using you to save me. Grace gave a faint, emotional smile. Maybe we both needed saving. Eleanor reached out, placing her hands over theirs. Then let's stop fighting and start healing. That's what family does. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The clouds parted, letting sunlight pour through the mansion's tall windows, casting golden light on the table where 3 generations, long divided, sat together for the first time. But as the warmth filled the room, Benjamin cleared his throat. There's one more thing you all should know. Daniel frowned. What now? Benjamin opened his folder again. The trust contains one final clause, a handwritten note from Mr. William Blake himself. It states that the inheritance can only remain with the rightful heir if she fulfills one condition. Grace's heart skipped. Condition? Yes. It says, the heir must use a portion of the inheritance to restore what was broken and rebuild what was forgotten.
Smiled softly, her eyes glistening. I think I know exactly what that means. Grace did too, though she couldn't have imagined how far that promise would take her next. The words echoed in Grace's mind like a whisper from heaven. restore what was broken, and rebuild what was forgotten. She sat in silence, her fingers tracing the embossed seal on the document. Elijah leaned against her side, his small hand resting in hers. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small, she felt chosen. Eleanor smiled softly. William always said, money without meaning is just metal and paper. He wanted our family to remember that. Grace exhaled slowly. Then, that's what I'll do, she said, her voice trembling but firm. If this inheritance was meant to rebuild, then I'll start where life fell apart for me and for others like me. Daniel looked skeptical but curious. You mean back in your neighborhood? Grace nodded. The East Side, where I grew up, where people work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, where single moms like me choose between rent and dinner. She met his gaze steadily. That's what's been forgotten. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Your grandmother would be proud of you. Benjamin, ever the professional, closed his briefcase but lingered. If you decide to proceed, the trust allows for immediate funding. You could form a community initiative under your own name. Grace gave a faint laugh. Under my name? I'm just a waitress. Eleanor chuckled. You were a waitress, dear. Now you're a Carter and a Blake, which means you can do more than serve tables. You can serve hearts. Daniel leaned back, studying her thoughtfully. If you're serious about this, I could help. I have resources, connections, experience. Grace interrupted gently, smiling. Experience running multi-million-dollar companies? Or experience listening to people who can barely afford breakfast? Daniel blinked, then grinned for the first time in days. Touché. The tension in the room began to dissolve into something lighter, warmer. Elijah bounced in his seat. Mom, can I help too? Grace kissed his forehead. Of course you can, baby. You're the reason I never gave up. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane. Before we move forward, there's something I'd like to show you both. She led them down a long hallway lined with old photographs, generations of Blake smiling stiffly in black and white. At the end of the hall hung a faded portrait of a young woman with gentle eyes and a kind smile. Eleanor stopped in front of it, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth Carter, your grandmother. The only Blake who ever believed love mattered more than wealth. Grace stared at the portrait, her throat tightening. She looks like my mother. She was brave, she said softly, and she paid dearly for it. Now you have the chance to finish what she started, to build bridges instead of walls. Grace nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. Then that's exactly what I'll do. Daniel checked his watch. If you'd like, I can schedule a press announcement. The world will want to hear this story. Grace smiled faintly. Not yet. Let the world wait. For now, I just want to start with one thing, reopening the old community center on Lincoln Avenue. That's where my mom used to take me. It's abandoned now, full of dust and graffiti, but it could be something beautiful again. Eleanor's eyes shone. Rebuild what was forgotten, she whispered. That's the place. Daniel nodded slowly, moved despite himself. I'll fund the restoration personally. Consider it a peace offering. Grace looked at him and smiled. Thank you, Daniel. Maybe this is how we fix our story. One act of kindness at a time. Outside, the sunlight spilled across the manicured lawns, glinting off the hood of the black SUV, the same one that had arrived as a symbol of fear, now gleaming as a sign of hope. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt the rain had finally done its work, not to destroy, but to cleanse. 3 weeks later, the broken shell of the old Lincoln Avenue Community Center was alive again with sound, laughter, hammers, music, and hope. The once crumbling building that had served as a shelter decades ago was now filled with volunteers. Men in expensive suits worked beside teenagers in worn jeans.
Mothers painted walls while children swept the floors, each stroke and smile breathing life into what was forgotten. Grace stood in the middle of it all, wearing a white hard hat that was a size too big and a grin that felt endless. Elijah ran between the workers, carrying paintbrushes and bottled water like the world's youngest foreman. "Careful, buddy," Grace called, laughing. "Don't spill on the new floor." He looked up at her, beaming. "I'm helping, Mom. Mr. Blake said I'm his assistant today." Daniel, standing near the entrance in rolled-up sleeves and dusty shoes, gave a mock salute. "He's got management potential," he said with a wink.
Grace laughed, shaking her head. "And you're not so bad for a billionaire." Daniel smiled, watching her with quiet admiration. The woman who had once served coffee at Benny's Diner was now commanding a crowd, transforming a forgotten building into a heartbeat for the community. Her kindness was contagious. People wanted to follow her. Eleanor arrived soon after, leaning on her cane but radiant with pride. "Would you look at this place?" she whispered, tears glinting in her eyes. Ruth would be smiling from heaven. Grace turned, walking toward her. "We're calling it the Ruth Carter Center for Hope," she said softly. "It's more than a name. It's a promise." Eleanor gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, Grace, you've given her memory life again." Daniel stepped closer. "We've got the funding secured for the next 5 years," he added. "And the foundation will provide scholarships for single mothers and kids from the East Side. You did this." Grace shook her head. "We did this. You believed in it too." Daniel's gaze softened. "Maybe believing in you was what I needed to start believing in something real again." The words hung between them, warm, genuine, unforced. Grace smiled, but her eyes shimmered. "You know, for someone who used to talk like a contract, that almost sounded like poetry." He chuckled. "Careful, I might make that my next press quote." The crowd erupted into applause as Elijah pulled the tarp off a new plaque by the entrance. The silver letters gleamed in the afternoon sun. The Ruth Carter Center for Hope. Restoring what was broken. Rebuilding what was forgotten. Grace felt her heart swell. The black SUV that once symbolized uncertainty was now parked outside, loaded with supplies instead of fear. Everything had come full circle. Eleanor wiped a tear. "Grace, your grandmother's blood runs strong in you. You turned pain into purpose." Grace knelt to hug her. "You gave me the chance to find it." As the sun began to set, Daniel joined her by the entrance. "You changed this place," he said quietly, "and me." She looked at him with a soft smile. "No, Daniel, you just remembered who you were before the world told you to forget." They stood together, watching families enter the newly painted doors, children laughing, elderly couples smiling, and mothers holding their little ones with hope in their eyes. Eleanor's voice carried gently through the hum of joy. "Do you see, my dear? Grace was never just your name. It was your destiny." And as the first night lights of the center flickered on, illuminating the words of the plaque, the rain began again, not in sorrow, but as a baptism of new beginnings. The grand reopening night arrived bathed in golden light. Lanterns lined the walkway of the Ruth Carter Center for Hope, glowing softly against the cool evening air. Families from every corner of Detroit gathered. Men in work boots, women in church hats, kids chasing balloons across the lawn. Music drifted from inside, the sound of a choir singing Amazing Grace echoing through the streets. Grace stood at the entrance, wearing a simple white dress that shimmered under the lights. Her heart swelled as she watched Elijah hand out cookies he'd baked with volunteers. "You see, Mom," he said proudly. "Everyone's smiling tonight." She knelt beside him, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, baby. Everyone's smiling because love came home." From behind her, a warm voice spoke. "And because of you." Grace turned to see Daniel, dressed in a modest suit instead of his usual armor of power. He held a small bouquet of lilies, her mother's favorite. "For you, and for what you've built." Grace smiled softly. "I didn't build it alone." "No," Daniel admitted, his gaze steady, "but you reminded us all how to start." Eleanor approached slowly, her cane tapping softly on the pavement. Her face glowed with peace. "My heart is full," she said, her voice trembling. "For decades I prayed for redemption, and tonight I can feel it.
Our family was divided by pride, but restored by grace, in every sense of the word. Grace took Eleanor's hand and kissed it gently. You didn't lose your family, Mrs. Blake. You found it in a diner on a rainy night. The old woman chuckled through tears. And I'd walk through that storm 100 times if it meant finding you again. Inside, the ceremony began. Daniel took the stage first, his voice echoing across the room. For years, I believed success was measured in numbers, not hearts. But then, I met someone who taught me that real power is the ability to lift others. He turned toward Grace. She showed me what it means to live with purpose. Applause erupted. Grace stepped forward next, her voice calm but full of emotion. When the rain fell that night, I thought it was another storm I had to survive. But it wasn't just weather. It was a blessing. It brought me family, forgiveness, and faith that good still wins. She looked at the crowd, tears glistening in her eyes. Sometimes the miracle isn't that the storm ends, it's that it leads you where you were always meant to be. The audience rose in applause, many wiping tears. Elijah ran onto the stage and hugged her waist tightly. Daniel and Eleanor joined them, the four of them framed under the bright lights. A new family, forged not just by blood, but by compassion. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, followed by soft rain. As if heaven itself was giving its blessing. Grace looked up, smiling. Guess the storm wanted to come back to say goodbye. Eleanor laughed softly. Or maybe it's saying thank you. Daniel slipped his arm gently around Grace's shoulders. To think, one night of kindness could rewrite an entire family's story. She turned to him, eyes bright with gratitude. That's what grace does. It doesn't just forgive, it transforms. As the choir's final notes soared through the night, the crowd lifted candles, their flames reflecting in the wet pavement like stars reborn. The once-forgotten corner of Detroit glowed with new life, proof that love could rise even from ruin. And beneath that soft rain, the same rain that began it all, Grace Carter closed her eyes, whispered a prayer of thanks, and smiled through her tears. Because what had started as a storm of despair had become the greatest blessing she could ever imagine. The end. A single black mom sheltered a lost old woman and a little boy, and found herself in the storm.